The phone rang at exactly 0800 hours on a Tuesday morning that would split my life into before and after. Admiral Rebecca Martinez was on the line, her voice crisp with the authority that comes from commanding respect across the seven seas. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Captain Harrison, she said, congratulations on your selection for command of the USS Constellation. You'll be taking over the most advanced aircraft carrier in the Pacific Fleet. I stood there in my kitchen, still in my civilian clothes, coffee mug trembling in my hand, as 22 years of military service crystallized into this single moment. Command of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, 90,000 tons of American naval power, 5,000 souls under my responsibility. The dream I'd carried since I was 12 years old, watching Top Gun in a darkened theater while my family laughed at my wide-eyed fascination. Thank you, Admiral, I managed, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. It's an honor I don't take lightly, but even as I spoke those words, another voice echoed in my memory, my brother's voice from 3 months earlier, cutting through the warm April air at our family barbecue like a rusty blade. Face it, Rebecca, you've always cracked under pressure. Some people are just built differently, and you're not one of them. The laughter that followed still rang in my ears, not cruel laughter, but something worse. The casual dismissal of people who genuinely believed they were being helpful. My mother nodded along, my father's uncomfortable silence, my sister's pitying smile. 22 years of military excellence, and they still saw the scared teenager who'd thrown up before her high school debate team tryouts. Admiral Martinez was still talking, outlining the ceremony details, the media presence, the significance of being only the third woman to command a carrier in Navy history. But all I could think about was that barbecue, and how I'd stood there with my burger growing cold, watching my family casually demolish the foundation of who I thought I was. It had started innocently enough. Memorial Day weekend, the annual Blackwood family gathering at my parents' house in suburban Columbus. I'd driven up from Norfolk still wearing my service dress blues from a promotion ceremony earlier that day. The gold oak leaves of my new captain's rank caught the sunlight as I walked through the back gate, and for a moment, just a moment, I felt proud to come home wearing the uniform that represented everything I'd worked for. My brother Jake was manning the grill, beer in one hand, spatula in the other, holding court with his usual audience of Dad and Uncle Mike. Jake had always been the golden child, the one who stayed close to home, married his high school sweetheart, took over Dad's insurance business. Safe choices, predictable path, everyone's definition of success. Look who's here, Jake called out when he saw me, our very own Captain America. There was affection in his voice, but underneath it was something else, something that had been growing over the years as my rank increased and my responsibilities expanded, something that would reveal itself before the potato salad was served. Mom appeared at my elbow with a plate already loaded with food, the way she'd done since I was 7. Sweetheart, you look so official in that uniform, but you must be exhausted with all that stress. When was the last time you really relaxed? I should have recognized the opening shot. Mom had perfected the art of expressing concern while simultaneously questioning capability. It was her signature move, delivered with such maternal warmth that you almost missed the blade sliding between your ribs. I'm doing fine, Mom, I said, accepting the plate and looking for somewhere to sit that wasn't in the direct line of fire. But in the Blackwood family, there was no neutral ground. Every conversation was a battlefield where my career choices were constantly under review. Rebecca's up for something big, my father announced, settling into his lawn chair with the careful movements of a man whose back hadn't quite recovered from 40 years of desk work. Carrier command, right? That's what you said on the phone. The way he said it, like he was announcing I'd applied for a job at the local grocery store, should have been my second warning. But I was still operating under the delusion that my family understood what I'd achieved, what I was on the verge of achieving. The selection board meets next month, I confirmed, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. 22 years of proving myself, and I still felt like I needed to downplay my accomplishments around them. It would be commanded by a Nimitz-class carrier. About 5,000 crew members. Uncle Mike whistled low. 5,000 people, that's like being mayor of a small town. Hell, That's bigger than our whole county, except it's a floating town with nuclear reactors and enough firepower to level a country, I added, finally allowing a hint of pride to creep in. The responsibility is incredible, but it's what I've been working toward my entire career. That's when Jake set down his beer and turned to face me fully. I should have seen it coming. I should have recognized the shift in his posture, the way his voice changed when he was about to deliver what he considered hard truth. But I was still thinking like a sister instead of like an officer, still vulnerable to the family dynamics that had shaped me long before I learned to command respect from hardened sailors. "Rebecca," he said, and the barbecue fell quiet. Even the neighbors seemed to pause their own conversation. "I love you, but I have to ask, do you really think you're ready for something like that?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the grill. I felt my stomach tighten, the same way it had during my first night carrier landing when the deck was pitching in 12-foot swells and I had to trust my instruments more than my instincts. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. Jake glanced around the circle, gathering support the way he always did before delivering a verdict. "I mean, you've always been brilliant at the technical stuff. Nobody's questioning that, but command is different. It's about handling pressure, making split-second decisions when lives are on the line. And honestly, sis, you've never been great under pressure." The words hit like a depth charge, exploding deep in my chest and sending shockwaves through everything I thought I knew about myself. 22 years of military service, multiple combat deployments, commendations for performance under fire, and my brother was reducing me to the teenage girl who'd hyperventilated before a school presentation. "Jake," my father said quietly, but he didn't disagree. The silence spoke volume. "What?" Jake continued, warming to his theme. "Remember the debate team thing? Remember when she threw up before her SAT? Hell, remember when she was so nervous about her first date that she canceled it twice?" Each memory was like another round of ammunition, and my family was nodding along like he was reciting established facts rather than excavating ancient embarrassments that had nothing to do with who I'd become. "That was high school," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. My sister Sarah chimed in, her tone gentle but devastating. "What about when you called Mom crying after your first deployment? You were so homesick you wanted to quit." "I was 22 years old and 7,000 miles from home," I protested. "Everyone gets homesick, but not everyone calls home sobbing at 3 in the morning," Jake said. "Look, I'm not trying to be mean, I just think you need to be realistic about your limitations. Some people thrive under pressure, and some people crack. There's no shame in knowing which one you are." My mother reached over and patted my hand, her touch meant to be comforting but feeling more like a brand. "Sweetheart, we just don't want to see you set yourself up for failure. Maybe it's time to consider something a little less intense." As if commanding an aircraft carrier was like choosing between regular or decaf coffee. As if the Navy would even consider recommending someone for carrier command who couldn't handle pressure. As if 2 decades of proven performance meant nothing compared to a few teenage anxiety attacks. I sat there with my untouched burger, watching my family dismantle my dreams with the casual efficiency of people who genuinely believed they were being helpful. They weren't trying to hurt me, that was almost worse. They truly deeply believed that I was fundamentally unsuited for the responsibility I'd spent my entire adult life preparing to accept. "You know what your problem is?" Jake continued, apparently not finished delivering his diagnosis. "You've always been too sensitive, too worried about what everyone thinks. Command isn't about being liked, it's about making hard decisions and living with the consequences. Can you honestly say you're ready for that level of pressure?" The question sat there like an unexploded bomb. Everyone was looking at me, waiting for my response, but I couldn't find words that would bridge the gap between who they thought I was and who I'd actually become. The teenage girl they remembered and the naval officer I'd spent decades forging were 2 different people, but they couldn't see past the scared kid who'd once thrown up from nerves. "I've been making life and death decisions for years," I said finally. "I've commanded ships in combat zones, managed crews through natural disasters, coordinated rescue operations in conditions that would terrify most people. The Navy doesn't promote people who crack under pressure." Uncle Mike shrugged. "Maybe the Navy doesn't know you like we do." "Like they knew me," As if the scared 16-year-old who'd been too nervous to drive to her own birthday party was the definitive version of who I'd always be. As if growth wasn't possible. As if 22 years of proving myself had been an elaborate performance rather than the gradual emergence of my true character. I looked around the circle of faces, people who'd known me my entire life, who'd celebrated my promotions and commendations, who'd cheered when I became an officer, who'd bragged about their daughter, sister, niece in the Navy. But underneath the pride I finally saw what had always been there, the fundamental belief that I was still that anxious teenager, dressed up in an impressive uniform but ultimately unchanged. The conversation moved on to other topics: Sarah's new house, Dad's retirement plans, Jake's son's baseball season, but I sat there in my dress blues surrounded by my family, feeling more isolated than I'd ever felt in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That night, I called my mentor, Captain Elena Rodriguez, who'd commanded the USS George Washington before retiring to teach at the Naval War College. I needed to hear from someone who actually understood what carrier command meant, what it required, what it revealed about a person's capability. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. "Blackwood," she said when she heard my voice. "You sound like someone just told you the Navy's been dissolved. What's wrong?" I told her about the barbecue, about my family's concerns, about the gnawing doubt that maybe they saw something I couldn't see in myself. Elena listened without interruption, the way she'd taught me to listen to my own junior officers when they came to me with problems that seemed larger than their ability to solve. "Rebecca," she said when I finished, "do you remember your first night trap on the Lincoln?" I did remember. Pitch black, heavy seas, crosswinds that made the carrier deck look like a postage stamp from the cockpit of an FA-18. I'd been 28 years old, still proving myself, still fighting the voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like Jake's voice at the barbecue. "You were scared," Elena continued. "I could see it in your face when you climbed out of that cockpit. But you did it anyway. You were trapped at night in conditions that veteran pilots were waving off from. That's not luck, and it's not an accident. That's what we call performing under pressure." "But what if they're right?" I asked. "What if I'm just good at faking it?" Elena's laugh was sharp and certain. "Honey, you can't fake a night carrier landing. You can't fake leading damage control during a fire at sea. You can't fake coordinating a humanitarian mission in hostile water. Your family loves you, but they don't know you. The Navy knows you. Your performance record knows you. And deep down, you know you." She was right, of course. But knowing she was right and feeling she was right were two different things. I hung up the phone that night, still carrying the weight of my family's doubts, still hearing Jake's voice asking if I could honestly handle that level of pressure. 3 months later, Admiral Martinez was on the line with an answer that would silence every doubt, every question, every casual dismissal of my capability. But at that moment, sitting in my kitchen with the coffee growing cold and the magnitude of the appointment settling in, all I could think about was calling Jake. Not to gloat, not to prove a point, but to share the news with someone who'd known me since I was 5 years old and had always, despite everything, been proud of his little sister, even if he didn't always understand what there was to be proud of. I didn't call Jake right away. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table for 43 minutes, staring at Admiral Martinez's official letter that had arrived by courier 20 minutes after our phone conversation. The Navy seal embossed at the top seemed to mock me, because even holding this historic appointment in my hands, I could still hear my family's voices drowning out the congratulations. The pattern had been there all along, hidden beneath birthday cards and Christmas visits, and proud social media posts about their daughter in the Navy. I'd just been too close to see it, too invested in believing that blood meant unconditional support. But sitting there with the most significant achievement of my career reduced to background noise by my own self-doubt, the truth finally crystallized with brutal clarity. They had never actually believed in me. Not once, not ever. Every promotion had been met with surprise rather than pride. Every deployment had prompted warnings about the dangers rather than confidence in my abilities. Every challenge I'd overcome had been reframed as luck, or help from others, or the Navy's mistake in judgment rather than evidence of my own competence. I pulled out my phone and scrolled back through years of text messages, looking for proof that I was wrong, that my family's love had always included faith in my capabilities. What I found instead was a masterclass in subtle undermining disguised as When I'd been selected for nuclear training. "Are you sure you can handle all that technical stuff, honey? Maybe something a little easier would be better." When I'd received my first command assignment. "Just remember, it's okay to ask for help. No one expects you to know everything." When I'd been promoted to commander. "Don't let it go to your head. Remember where you came from." Every achievement had come with a qualifier, every success with a warning, every promotion with a reminder of my limitation. They'd been systematically eroding my confidence for 2 decades, and I'd been so grateful for their attention that I'd mistaken their sabotage for support. The worst part wasn't even the doubt they'd planted, it was how I'd internalized it. How I'd started presenting my accomplishments as lucky breaks rather than earned victories. How many times had I downplayed my achievements to make them comfortable? How many conversations had I redirected away from my career because I could sense their discomfort with my success? I remembered the last time I'd tried to share something meaningful with them. 6 months ago, I'd been awarded the Legion of Merit for my role in coordinating a multinational disaster relief operation in the Philippines. It was a career-defining moment. The kind of recognition that marked an officer as destined for higher command. I'd called home, excited to share the news with people who'd raised me. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," my mother had said, but her tone was flat, distracted. "Jake just got promoted to regional manager at the agency. Isn't that exciting? He'll be overseeing 7 offices now." The conversation had immediately pivoted to Jake's promotion, which involved managing 43 people in suburban Ohio. My coordination of relief efforts for hundreds of thousands of typhoon victims became a footnote to his advancement in the insurance industry. I'd hung up feeling smaller, less significant, wondering if maybe civilian achievements were more important than military ones. But now, staring at my appointment letter, I realized the truth. They weren't comfortable with my success because it made them confront their own limitations. Jake had never left Columbus. Never tested himself against anything more challenging than quarterly sales targets. Sarah had married her college boyfriend and settled into a life of comfortable predictability. My parents had built a safe, small world and never ventured beyond its border. My success wasn't just different from theirs, it was threatening. Every promotion, every deployment, every challenge I'd overcome was evidence that the world was bigger than they'd allowed themselves to imagine. Instead of celebrating my courage, they'd spent 22 years trying to convince me that I was just as small as they were. The phone rang. Jake's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something had shifted in me during those 43 minutes of clarity. The scared little sister who'd always sought their approval was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood the game they'd been playing. "Hey, Jake," I answered, my voice steady. "Rebecca, Mom told me you got some big news today. Congratulations on whatever it is." His tone was cheerful but generic, the way you'd congratulate someone on a promotion you didn't really understand or care about. "I've been selected for command of the USS Constellation. It's a nuclear aircraft carrier. I'll be responsible for 5,000 crew members and about $6 billion of military hardware." There was a pause. Not the pause of someone processing good news, but the pause of someone recalibrating their response to information that didn't fit their narrative. "Wow," he said finally. That's really something. Are you sure you're ready for all that responsibility?" And there it was. Not congratulations, not pride, not excited for his sister's historic achievement, just doubt, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd never commanded anything more complex than a backyard barbecue. "Actually, Jake, I am sure," I said. "I've been preparing for this my entire career. The Navy doesn't hand out carrier commands to people they don't trust." "Well, of course," he backpedaled quickly. "I just meant, it's a lot of pressure, and you've always been, well, you know how you get when things get stressful. How I get when things get stressful." As if my teenage anxiety was a permanent character flaw rather than a phase I'd outgrown, through years of facing down challenges that would leave him paralyzed with fear. "Jake," I said, and something in my voice must have warned him that this conversation wasn't going to follow the usual script. Do you have any idea what I actually do in the Navy? Of course I do. You're an officer. You fly planes and give orders and stuff. The casual dismissal of 22 years of service as flying planes and giving orders and stuff was like a slap across the face. He had no idea that I'd landed jets on pitching carrier decks in the middle of storms. No idea that I'd led damage control efforts during a fire that could have killed hundreds. No idea that I'd coordinated rescue operations that had saved thousands of lives. To him, my career was just an elaborate hobby that I'd somehow managed to turn into a job. Last year, I said slowly, I commanded the relief effort after Typhoon Maria hit the Philippines. I coordinated 17 ships, 43 aircraft, and over 8,000 personnel from 6 different countries. We delivered food and medical supplies to 300,000 people. We evacuated critically injured civilians to hospital ships. We restored communication infrastructure to an area the size of Pennsylvania. Silence on the other end of the line. 2 years before that, I was the officer in charge when we intercepted a ship carrying enough fentanyl to kill everyone in Ohio. The boarding operation took place in 20-foot seas. At night, with armed smugglers on deck, I made the tactical decisions that prevented that poison from reaching American streets. Still silent. 6 months ago, we had a reactor emergency during a storm in the North Pacific, the kind of emergency that could have resulted in a nuclear incident. I was the senior officer who managed the response, coordinated with engineering teams, and got us safely to port. The investigation concluded that my decisions prevented a potential catastrophe. I paused, letting the weight of actual responsibility settle into the conversation. So, when you ask if I can handle pressure, Jake, I need you to understand what you're really asking. You're asking if the woman who's been making life and death decisions for 2 decades can handle the pressure of command. You're asking if someone the United States Navy trusts with nuclear weapons can be trusted with leadership responsibility. The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. I didn't know, he said finally, his voice small. You never really talk about the serious stuff. Because every time I try, you change the subject or make it about stress and pressure and how I can't handle things. You've spent so many years telling me what I can't do that I stopped trying to share what I can do. That's not. I mean, we've always been proud of you. No, Jake. You've been proud of the idea of me. Proud of having a sister in the Navy. Proud of the uniform and the rank and the respect that comes with it. But you've never been proud of me as a person capable of earning those things through competence and courage. I could hear him breathing, and could almost feel him struggling with concepts that didn't fit into his comfortable worldview. The thing is, I continued, I spent so many years trying to prove myself to people who had already decided I couldn't succeed, that I almost forgot I'd already succeeded. I've been seeking validation from people who are fundamentally incapable of giving it, because acknowledging my strength would force them to confront their own limitations. Rebecca, that's not fair. Isn't it? When's the last time any of you asked me about my work without immediately expressing concern about my ability to handle it? When's the last time you celebrated one of my achievements without qualifying it with worry about the pressure? When's the last time you looked at my career and saw competence instead of lucky accidents? He couldn't answer, because the answer was never, not once, not ever. I used to think your doubt came from love. I thought you were just worried about me, just looking out for your little sister. But now I realize it comes from something else entirely. You need me to be small, because my success makes you feel small. You need me to doubt myself because my confidence highlights your own fear. That's not true, he protested, but there was no conviction in his voice. Jake, you've never left Columbus. You've never tested yourself against anything scarier than a quarterly performance review. You married your high school girlfriend, took over Dad's business, and built a life designed to minimize risk and challenge. There's nothing wrong with that choice. But it means you can't recognize courage when you see it. The words hung between us like smoke from a battle that had been fought for 22 years without either of us realizing we were on opposite sides. I'm not trying to hurt you, I said more gently. I'm trying to help you understand that your limitations aren't mine. Your fears aren't mine. Your definition of what's possible isn't mine. So what now, he asked. You just decide we're not good enough for you anymore? The question revealed everything. Not congratulations on my achievement. Not curiosity about what carrier command meant. Not recognition that maybe he'd been wrong about my capabilities. Just defensive self-pity disguised as hurt feelings. Now I stop asking for permission to succeed, I said. I stopped downplaying my achievements to make you comfortable. I stopped seeking validation from people who are constitutionally incapable of providing. I looked at Admiral Martinez's letter again, at the official language commending my exceptional leadership under the most demanding circumstances, and proven ability to command complex operations in high-stress environments. The Navy saw me clearly. My fellow officers saw me clearly. My subordinates and superiors alike trusted me with responsibilities that most people couldn't even imagine. It was only my family who insisted on seeing the scared teenager I used to be instead of the competent officer I'd become. And suddenly, with perfect clarity, I realized that their opinion was the least important one in the room. I have to go, Jake, I said. I have a carrier to command. I hung up before he could respond. Before he could make it about his hurt feelings, or my unfairness, or the family loyalty I was supposedly abandoning. For the first time in my adult life, I ended a conversation with my family on my own terms. When I was finished saying what needed to be said, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, full of the space I'd finally created between who they needed me to be and who I actually was. I wasn't their anxious little sister anymore. I wasn't their cautionary tale about reaching too high. I wasn't their project to be managed and contained and protected from challenges they couldn't imagine handling themselves. I was Captain Rebecca Blackwood, United States Navy, selected for command of a nuclear aircraft carrier, trusted with the lives of 5,000 sailors and the security of the nation. And for the first time in 22 years, that was enough. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in 22 years of military service. I called in, not because I was ill, but because I needed time to process what was about to happen and make some decisions that would reshape every relationship in my life. Captain Elena Rodriguez had taught me that true leadership sometimes meant making moves that others couldn't understand until after the fact. As I sat in my apartment, still in my pajamas at 1100 hours, I realized this was one of those moments. The Navy had given me the ultimate validation of my capabilities, but my family's response had made it clear that no external achievement would ever be enough to change their fundamental view of who I was. So I decided to stop trying. Instead, I started planning something that would force them to confront the reality of what I'd become, whether they wanted to or not. The idea crystallized while I was reviewing the official ceremony details. Admiral Martinez had emailed. The change of command ceremony for USS Constellation would take place in 3 weeks at Naval Base San Diego. It would be attended by admirals, congressmen, defense contractors and media representatives from around the world. The ceremony would be broadcast live on Navy television and streamed online. It would be in every sense a historic moment. My family had never attended any of my military ceremonies, not my commissioning, not my promotion ceremonies, not my medal presentation. They always had excuses. Work commitments, distance, Jake's kids, soccer games, but they'd never been invited to anything this significant, and they'd never had to choose between showing up and admitting they didn't think I was worth the effort. I picked up my phone and started a group text to Jake, Sarah and my parents. I'm being given command of USS Constellation on November 15th at Naval Base San Diego. The ceremony starts at 1000 hours. I'm attaching your flight information and hotel reservations. Everything is paid for. I'll understand if you can't make it, but this is the only invitation you'll receive. I attached the airline confirmations I'd just purchased. First-class tickets from Columbus to San Diego. Rooms at the Hotel del Coronado. Rental car reservation. $12,000 I'd spent in 30 minutes. Not because I thought they deserved it, but because I wanted to remove every possible excuse they might offer for not showing up. The responses came faster than I'd expected. Sarah. First. Rebecca. This is incredible. I had no idea it was such a big deal. Of course we'll be there. Dad next. Proud of you, sweetheart. This is quite an honor. Mom. Oh my goodness, the Hotel del Coronado. I've always wanted to stay there. Thank you for thinking of us. And then Jake. 3 hours later. This is amazing. I'm sorry about yesterday. I really didn't understand what you'd accomplished. We'll all be there. I stared at their responses, feeling something cold settle in my chest. Not anger. Exactly. But a crystalline understanding of how transactional their support really was. When I was sharing military achievements from a distance, they were uncomfortable and dismissive. But when those achievements came with first-class flights and luxury accommodations, suddenly they were proud and excited. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation that had nothing to do with the ceremony itself. I already knew how to take command of a ship. I'd done it before, just never one this large or significant. What I was preparing for was something else entirely, the moment when my family would finally see me in my actual element, commanding the respect of people whose opinions carried real weight in the world. Captain Michael Thompson, my predecessor, had commanded Constellation for 3 years, and was transferring to a Pentagon assignment. During our final transition meeting, he asked me something that caught me off guard. You seem different than usual, Blackwood. More focused, I guess. Is everything okay? I considered how to answer. Mike and I had worked together before, and he knew me well enough to sense the shift in my energy. I'm about to find out whether my family actually knows who I am, I said finally. He raised an eyebrow. Family revelations, I corrected. They're coming to the ceremony, first time they've ever attended anything Navy-related. Ah, he said, understanding immediately. The moment of truth. Something like that. Mike leaned back in his chair, studying me with the careful attention of an officer who'd spent his career reading people. You know, Blackwood, I've watched you operate for 5 years now. Combat deployments, emergency situations, high-stakes operations. You're one of the steadiest officers I've ever served with. If your family doesn't see that, it says nothing about you and everything about them. I'm starting to understand that, I said. Good, because in 3 days, you're going to be responsible for more than just proving yourself to family members. You're going to be responsible for proving yourself to history. He was right, of course. The ceremony wasn't about my family at all. It was about accepting responsibility for one of the most powerful weapons platforms in human history. But I'd spent so many years seeking their validation that untangling my personal worth from their opinion felt like learning to breathe underwater. 2 days before the ceremony, I received a call that changed everything. Captain Blackwood, this is Admiral Patricia Hayes, Chief of Naval Operations. I nearly dropped my phone. The CNO was the highest-ranking officer in the Navy, the advisor to the President on naval matters, the person who ultimately decided the fate of every sailor in the fleet. Admiral Hayes, this is an honor, Captain, I'm calling to personally congratulate you on your selection for Constellation Command. I wanted you to know that your appointment represents something significant for the Navy. You're not just taking command of a ship, you're helping us prove that leadership has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with competence. She paused, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background. I've reviewed your service record extensively, she continued. Your performance during the reactor incident last year was textbook leadership under extreme pressure. Your coordination of the Philippines relief effort demonstrated exactly the kind of multidimensional thinking we need in senior command. And your combat performance throughout 3 deployments shows the kind of steady nerves that make great warfighters. Thank you, Admiral. I won't let you down. I know you won't. But I'm calling for another reason as well. The President will be attending your ceremony. The world stopped spinning. The President, Admiral. President Morrison wanted to personally participate in this historic moment. It's not every day we commission the 3rd woman to command a carrier, and certainly not one with your distinguished record. This ceremony will be covered by every major news outlet in the country. I sat down heavily, trying to process what she was telling me. The President of the United States would be there. Every major news network, international coverage. This wasn't just a promotion ceremony anymore.
It was a statement about American naval power and the evolution of military leadership. "There's one more thing, Captain," Admiral Hayes continued. "We'd like you to give remarks during the ceremony. Something about your journey, your perspective on command, your vision for the future. The speech will likely be quoted in military academies for decades. No pressure." She laughed at her own joke, but I understood what she was really saying. This moment would define not just my career, but how future generations of naval officers understood what was possible. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment for an hour, staring at the wall and trying to reconcile two realities. In 3 days I would stand before the president, admirals, congressmen and international media as they entrusted me with command of one of the most powerful ships ever built. And watching from the audience would be my family, who just 6 months ago had questioned whether I could handle the pressure of leadership. That evening, I called Elena Rodriguez one more time. "Elena, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Am I ready for this? Not the ceremony, not the politics, but the actual command. 5,000 lives, nuclear reactors, enough firepower to level a city. Am I actually ready for that responsibility?" She was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. "Rebecca," she said finally, "do you remember the first day we met?" I did. I'd been a lieutenant commander, assigned to her staff aboard USS George Washington. She'd been the most intimidating officer I'd ever encountered. Brilliant, demanding, absolutely uncompromising in her standard. "You asked me the same question that day," she continued, "whether you were ready for the responsibility of a department head position. Do you remember what I told you? You said readiness isn't a feeling, it's a track record. And what's your track record, Captain?" I thought about the reactor emergency, the typhoon relief, the counter-narcotics operations, the combat missions, the countless smaller crises that had tested my judgment and found it sound. 22 years of making the right calls under pressure, I said.
Then you have your answer. The Navy doesn't make mistakes about carrier command. If they're giving you Constellation, it's because you've already proven you can handle anything they throw at you. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "But I think there's something else you're really asking. You're asking whether you deserve this, whether you're worthy of it, and that question isn't about your qualifications. It's about whether you can finally see yourself the way the rest of us see you." She was right. 22 years of family doubt had made me question not my competence, but my worth. Even with Admiral Hayes calling to congratulate me, even with the president planning to attend, even with the entire Navy demonstrating their confidence in my abilities, I was still waiting for permission to believe I belonged in this position. "Elena," I said, "what if they never see it? What if my family attends this ceremony and still somehow finds a way to diminish it? Then you'll finally understand that their blindness is not your burden to carry." The night before the ceremony, I did something I'd never done before. I wrote out exactly what I planned to say to my family if they questioned my readiness one more time. Not angry words, not defensive justifications, but a clear statement of reality that would leave no room for misinterpretation. I wouldn't need the speech if they finally understood what they were witnessing. But if they didn't, if they somehow managed to attend the ceremony where the president handed me command of a nuclear aircraft carrier and still found reasons to doubt my capabilities, then I would use it. Because I was done pretending their limitations were mine. I was done making myself smaller to fit their narrow definition of what was possible. I was done seeking validation from people who had spent 22 years proving they were incapable of giving it. Tomorrow I will become the commanding officer of USS Constellation. 5,000 sailors would call me captain. The president would shake my hand. The world would watch as the United States Navy entrusted me with responsibilities that most people couldn't even comprehend. And if my family still couldn't see who I'd become, that would tell them everything they needed to know about who they were. The ceremony had been everything I'd imagined and more. President Morrison's hand was firm when she shook mine, her words about the future of American naval leadership echoing across the flight deck of USS Constellation. 4,000 guests, including my family, had watched as I assumed command of the most advanced aircraft carrier in the world. The media coverage was unprecedented, Every major network, international press, social media streaming live to millions of viewers worldwide. But it was what happened in the hotel bar afterward that revealed who my family really was. The reception was winding down when I found them huddled around a high-top table in the Hotel del Coronado's crown room, drinks in hand, voices animated with excitement. Not excitement about my achievement, I would soon discover, but excitement about their proximity to it. Rebecca. Sarah called out when she spotted me. "There you are. We were just telling these people about how we're related to the new captain of the Constellation." These people turned out to be a group of tourists from Phoenix who'd recognized my family from the ceremony coverage on the bar's television. Jake was in the middle of what appeared to be a well-rehearsed story about growing up with America's newest naval hero. She was always destined for greatness, he was saying, gesturing broadly with his bourbon. Even as a kid, you could see she had that special the drive, the intelligence, the natural leadership ability. I stood there in my dress whites, medals catching the bar light, listening to my brother rewrite 22 years of history for strangers who'd never know the difference. The same man who'd questioned my ability to handle pressure just 4 months ago was now claiming credit for recognizing my potential all along. "Jake," I said quietly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" He excused himself from his new audience and followed me to a quieter corner of the bar. His face was flushed with alcohol and reflected glory, the kind of high that comes from being associated with someone important. "Hell of a day, sis," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "I had no idea it would be such a big production. The president. Can you believe?" Mom got a selfie with her during the reception line. "Did she now?" I said, keeping my voice neutral. "This is going to be incredible for all of us," he continued, apparently not hearing the ice in my tone. "I mean, having a sister who commands an aircraft carrier. Do you know how impressive that sounds at client meetings? Dad's already planning to update all the agency marketing materials to mention his daughter, the Navy captain." There it was. Not pride in my achievement, but excitement about how they could leverage it for their own benefit. Not recognition of my capabilities, but calculation of my value to their personal brands. "Jake," I said slowly, 4 months ago you told me I couldn't handle pressure. You questioned whether I was ready for command responsibility. You literally said some people are built differently and I wasn't one of them." His expression shifted. "Uncomfortable but not apologetic. That was before I understood what you were really capable of. I mean, seeing you up there today, taking command from the president herself. It's obvious you were always meant for this. So what changed your mind? Was it my performance? Or was it the cameras? Come on, Rebecca. Don't be like that. We've always supported you." The rewriting of history was breathtaking in its audacity, not just selective memory, but active reconstruction of events that had happened 4 months ago. In Jake's new narrative, they'd always believed in me, always supported my ambitions, always recognized my potential for greatness. "We need to talk," I said. "All of us. Family meeting in Mom and Dad's suite in 20 minutes. I walked away before he could respond, before he could smooth over the confrontation with charm and selective amnesia. The tourists from Phoenix could keep their manufactured stories about my supportive family. It was time for the real family to deal with some uncomfortable truth. 20 minutes later, I stood in the presidential suite I'd booked for my parents, looking at 4 people who'd spent decades shaping my self-image, and were now desperately trying to reshape their own role in my story. "This has been such an incredible day," Mom began, settling into the plush sofa with a glass of champagne. "We're so proud of what you've accomplished, sweetheart. All those years of hard work finally paying off. All those years," I repeated. "Mom, do you remember what you said when I told you I was applying for carrier command?" Her smile faltered slightly. "Of course I was supportive, dear. I always have been. You said maybe it was time to consider something less intense. You said you didn't want to see me set myself up for failure. Well, yes, but that was just motherly concern. I was worried about the stress, the pressure. You know how you used to get anxious about things." "Used to," I said, past tense. "But you've all been treating my anxiety from 20 years ago like it was a permanent disability that would prevent me from succeeding in my career." Dad cleared his throat, the way he always did when conversations got uncomfortable. "Rebecca, I think you're reading too much into this. We've always been proud of your service. Proud of my service. Yes, but never confident in my abilities. There's a difference. I walked to the window, looking out at the harbor where USS Constellation sat like a floating city, her nuclear reactors humming with the power that could light up half of San Diego. Tomorrow morning, I would walk aboard that ship as its commanding officer, responsible for technology that most people couldn't comprehend, and operations that could reshape global politics. Do you have any idea what I actually did today? I asked, turning back to face them. You became captain of an aircraft carrier, Sarah said promptly. It's a huge honor. I assumed command of a nuclear-powered warship, capable of projecting American military power anywhere in the world. I became responsible for 5,000 sailors, pilots and support personnel. I accepted stewardship of equipment worth $12 billion and weapon systems that could level entire countries. The room was quiet except for the sound of ice clinking in Dad's whiskey glass. The President of the United States personally handed me that responsibility, because she trusts my judgment in matters of national security. The Chief of Naval Operations called me personally to say that my appointment represents the future of American naval leadership. Every major news outlet in the country covered my ceremony as a historic moment. I paused, letting the magnitude of what had happened settle into the room. And 4 months ago, you told me I couldn't handle pressure. Rebecca, Jake said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he'd used since we were children, you're being dramatic. We were just concerned about you. Just looking out for your best interests. Were you projecting your own limitations onto me because my success made you uncomfortable? That's not fair, Sarah protested. We've always wanted what's best for you, have you? Because what would have been best for me was a family that believed in my capabilities instead of constantly questioning them. What would have been best for me was support instead of sabotage disguised as concern. Mom's eyes filled with tears, but they looked more like manipulation than genuine emotion. Sweetheart, we're family. We love you. We've always loved you. Love isn't enough, Mom, not when it comes with conditions and qualifications and constant doubt about my competence. Not when you only express pride after I've achieved something so undeniable that even you can't dismiss it. We never dismissed your achievements, Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the text messages I'd screenshotted months earlier, the ones that had revealed the pattern of undermining I'd been too close to see. When I was selected for nuclear training, you said I should consider something easy. When I got my first command, you reminded me it was okay to ask for help because no one expected me to know everything. When I was promoted to commander, you told me not to let it go to my head. I read each message aloud, watching their faces as their own words came back to haunt them. Every achievement came with a qualifier, every success came with a warning, every promotion came with a reminder of my limitations. You spent 22 years systematically undermining my confidence, and I was so grateful for any attention that I mistook sabotage for support. That's not what we were doing, Jake said, but he couldn't meet my eyes. Isn't it, Jake? You've never left Columbus. You've never tested yourself against anything more challenging than quarterly sales targets. Sarah, you married your college boyfriend and settled into the safest possible life. Mom and Dad, you built a small world and never ventured beyond its borders. The silence that followed was thick with uncomfortable truths. There's nothing wrong with those choices, I continued, but they disqualified you from judging my choices. You couldn't recognize courage because you'd never needed it. You couldn't understand competence under pressure, because you'd never faced real pressure. You couldn't celebrate my achievements because they reminded you of everything you'd been too afraid to attempt. So what now? Sarah asked, her voice small. You decide we're not good enough for you. Now I stop pretending that your opinions about my capabilities matter. I stopped seeking validation from people who spent 22 years proving they were incapable of providing. I moved toward the door, then turned back one final time. I love you all, but I don't need you to understand what I've accomplished, and I don't need your permission to be proud of it. The Navy understands. My fellow officers understand. The President understands. That's enough. The next morning, I received a flurry of text messages as my family prepared to fly back to Columbus. Jake, you're overreacting. We were just trying to help. Sarah, this is so typical of you, making everything about yourself. Mom, I'm heartbroken that you think we don't support you after everything we've done for you.
Dad, you're letting this success go to your head. Remember where you came from. Each message was a masterclass in manipulation, designed to make me doubt my perceptions and return to the role of a grateful daughter seeking their approval. But something had changed during that conversation in the hotel suite. Their words bounced off me like rain off a carrier's flight deck. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I walked aboard USS Constellation for the first time as her commanding officer, past Marines who snapped to attention, past sailors who looked at me with respect earned through competence rather than granted through biology. The ship felt different now that she was mine, not bigger but more alive, humming with the energy of 5,000 people who trusted my leadership because the Navy had deemed me worthy of their trust. My family would spend the flight home reconstructing the narrative, turning my confrontation into evidence of my ingratitude rather than their inadequacy. They would tell people about their daughter, the aircraft carrier captain, while simultaneously convincing themselves that my success had made me arrogant and difficult, but I wouldn't be there to hear it. I would be here, on the bridge of the most powerful warship in the world, doing the job I'd spent 22 years preparing for, surrounded by people who understood exactly what that meant. For the first time in my adult life, their opinions simply didn't matter. Part 5. The Unexpected Alliance. 3 weeks into my command of USS Constellation, I received a call that I never expected. The ship was conducting training exercises off the coast of California when my communications officer handed me a secured phone with an apologetic expression. "Captain, you have a priority call from someone claiming to be your cousin. She says it's urgent and family-related. Normally I wouldn't bother you with personal calls during exercises, but she mentioned classified information about your ceremony coverage. I only had one cousin who would know anything about classified aspects of naval operations, Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Blackwood, United States Marine Corps, Jake's oldest daughter who'd enlisted against her father's wishes 12 years earlier," I said, using the childhood nickname that had driven her crazy since she was 7, Aunt Rebecca. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "We need to talk. Are you somewhere you can speak freely?" I stepped into my private cabin adjacent to the bridge, closing the door behind me. "What's wrong?" "US. I saw the footage from your ceremony, the official coverage, the news reports, everything. It was incredible, and I was so proud I called Dad to congratulate him on having such an amazing sister. He spent 20 minutes telling me how they'd always known you were destined for greatness, how they'd supported your career from the beginning, how proud the whole family was of your achievement. Because I remember every family gathering for the past 12 years. I remember exactly how they talked about you when you weren't there. I remember Dad telling people you were playing soldier when you made lieutenant commander. I remember Grandma saying you were too intense and needed to find a nice civilian job and settle down. I remember Uncle Dave asking why you couldn't be more like Sarah and just get married instead of gallivanting around the world in a uniform. But the worst part," Patty continued, her voice shaking with suppressed fury, "was listening to Dad rewrite history like none of that ever happened, like they'd been your biggest supporters all along instead of your biggest doubter." I sat down heavily in my command chair, looking out at the Pacific Ocean, stretching endlessly in all directions. Even here, thousands of miles from home, my family's dysfunction could reach me. "How bad was it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Bad enough that I did something I've never done before. I recorded our conversation, because I've been watching this family gaslight you for over a decade, and I was tired of being the only one who remembered what really happened. Because you showed me that Blackwood women could be strong, could serve their country, could command respect through competence, instead of compliance. You were my hero long before the Navy gave you a carrier. In 22 years of military service, no one in my family had ever said anything like that to me. But watching them take credit for your success while denying their role and almost sabotaging it, I can't stay quiet anymore. I mean, I'm driving to Columbus tomorrow, and I'm going to have a conversation with my father and his siblings about how family loyalty works, about the difference between supporting someone and taking credit for their achievement. Patty, don't do anything that will damage your relationship with your father. This is my fight, not yours. I've been watching you succeed despite them for years. Not because of them. Someone needs to tell them the truth, and apparently I'm the only one with both the memory and the courage to do it. That they spent decades undermining your confidence, questioning your abilities, and treating your achievements like lucky accidents, that they only started claiming pride in your success after it became so undeniable that even they couldn't dismiss it, that their sudden support isn't love, it's opportunism. I walked to my cabin's porthole, watching FA-18 Super Hornets conducting touch-and-go landings on our flight deck. Each landing required absolute precision, complete confidence, and trust in both equipment and training. There was no room for doubt, no space for second-guessing, no tolerance for anyone who questioned the pilot's competence once they were in the cockpit. "Patty," I said slowly, "if you do this, there's no going back. They'll never forgive you for calling them out." "Good," she said without hesitation, "because I'll never forgive them for treating the best person in our family like she was a disappointment they had to manage." The conversation ended with Patty promising to call me after her confrontation with Jake. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on ship operations, but part of my mind kept drifting to what was happening in Columbus. For the first time in my adult life, someone from my family was fighting for me instead of against me. Patty's name flashed on the screen. "How did it go?" I asked without preamble. "Better than I expected," she said, though her voice sounded exhausted. "Worse than I hoped." I settled in for what I suspected would be a long conversation. Showed up at his office yesterday morning, and asked him to explain exactly when and how he'd supported your naval career, asked for specific examples of times he'd encouraged your ambitions, or celebrated your achievements without qualification. Started with the usual vague statements about always being proud, always supporting your choices. So I started giving him specific examples of things he'd said about you over the years. Direct quotes. I held my breath. Wait. At first he denied it, said I was misremembering, or taking things out of context. So I played him the recording from our conversation 2 days ago, where he claimed they'd always known you were destined for greatness. And then I played him a recording I made at Christmas 3 years ago, where he told Uncle Mike that you were too stubborn for your own good, and didn't know when to quit pushing for things that were probably beyond your capabilities. The silence stretched between us like a taut cable. He broke down, Aunt Rebecca. Actually, I broke down, started crying and saying he didn't realize how his words sounded, how they might have affected you. Said he was trying to protect you from disappointment, trying to manage your expectations, so you wouldn't get hurt. Did you believe him? I believed that he believed it, but I also told him that intent doesn't matter when the impact is damage, that protecting you from disappointment by convincing you that you weren't capable of success wasn't protection, it was sabotage. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the image of Jake crying, of my older brother finally confronting the gap between his intentions and his actions. What about the others? That was harder because they're old and set in their ways, and they genuinely don't understand why their concern was harmful. But I made them listen to examples of how they talked about your career, versus how they talked about Dad's business or Sarah's marriage. Grandma admitted that she'd never really understood what you did in the Navy, that it seemed dangerous and far away, and not like something a nice girl should want. But she also said she was sorry for not trying harder to understand. Sarah was the hardest conversation. She got defensive immediately, said I was attacking the family, said you'd always been dramatic and oversensitive. But when I asked her to name one time, just one, when she'd expressed confidence in your abilities instead of concern about your limitations, she couldn't do it. The thing is, Aunt Rebecca, I don't think they realized what they were doing. I think they genuinely believed they were being supportive, that expressing doubt was the same as expressing care. But the impact was that you spent 22 years seeking validation from people who were constitutionally incapable of giving it. What did you tell them? That you didn't need them to manage your expectations, you needed them to believe in your capabilities. That you didn't need their concerns about pressure, you needed their recognition that you'd already proven you could handle more pressure than any of them had ever faced. I felt something loosening in my chest, a tension I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it was there. "Gowned, and I told them something else," Patty continued. "I told them that you were the strongest person in our family, that you'd succeeded not because of their support, but despite their doubt, and that if they wanted a relationship with you going forward, they needed to acknowledge that." Dad asked what he could do to fix it. Grandma said she wanted to understand your career better. Sarah stormed out,
but she called me later that night and asked if I thought you'd be willing to talk to her. Uncle Dave said something that I think you need to hear. He said watching you take command of that carrier made him realize how small his own world had become. He said he'd spent so many years avoiding risk and challenge that he'd forgotten what courage looked like until he saw you on that flight deck. I stared out at the ocean, thinking about my father's comfortable insurance business, his safe suburban life, his careful avoidance of anything that might test his limit. But I told them they needed to think carefully about what they wanted to say, because you didn't owe them forgiveness, and you certainly didn't owe them another chance to undermine your confidence. But I also think you should know that this conversation changed something. Not everything, but something. They can't pretend anymore that their doubt was supported. They can't rewrite history to make themselves the heroes of your story. And most importantly, they can't dismiss your achievements as lucky accidents when they're forced to confront the reality of what you've accomplished. Patty had done something I'd never been able to do. She'd forced them to confront their own behavior instead of allowing them to hide behind noble intentions and selective memory. Someone had seen my worth clearly and been willing to defend it, even at personal cost. Someone had chosen truth over comfortable lies. That night, I walked out onto the flight deck under a canopy of stars, listening to the sounds of a ship that never slept. 5,000 sailors depended on my leadership, trusted my judgment, followed my orders without question. They didn't need to be convinced of my competence. They could see it in every decision I made, every crisis I navigated, every challenge I met with steady resolve. Maybe it was time for my family to see it too. The call came 6 weeks later, while USS Constellation was docked in Pearl Harbor for scheduled maintenance. I was reviewing engineering reports in my cabin when my aide knocked and informed me that my father was on the line, calling through official Navy channels. Captain Blackwood speaking, I answered, maintaining the professional tone I used for all official communications. Rebecca, it's Dad. His voice was different, quieter, less certain than I'd ever heard it. I know you're probably busy, but I was wondering if we could talk, face to face. I'd like to fly out to Hawaii if you'll see me. I set down my pen and leaned back in my chair. In 22 years of naval service, my father had never once visited me at any duty station. He'd never shown interest in seeing where I worked, how I lived, or what my daily responsibilities entailed. What did you want to talk about, Dad? About everything. About what Patty said, about how we've treated you, about how wrong I've been. He paused and I could hear him breathing heavily. About how sorry I am. You could say that over the phone. No, I couldn't. Not for something this important. Rebecca, I need to see where you work, what you do, who you've become. I need to understand what I've been too blind to see for 22 years. There was something in his voice that I'd never heard before, not the careful control he used when managing difficult insurance claims, not the false confidence he projected during family gatherings, but something raw and uncertain and genuinely humble. When I asked, this weekend, if you'll have me, I've already booked a flight to Honolulu. 3 days later, I stood on the pier at Pearl Harbor, watching my father walk down the gangway from a civilian charter that ferried visitors to the naval base. He looked smaller than I remembered, older, wearing a suit that seemed too formal for the Hawaiian heat. But what struck me most was his expression, not the patronizing smile he usually wore when dealing with what he considered my Navy phase, but something closer to apprehension. Dad, I said, offering my hand instead of the hug he seemed to expect. Captain, he replied, and there was genuine respect in the way he said it. Not the performative respect he'd shown at the ceremony, but something quieter and more authentic. Welcome aboard USS Constellation, I said, gesturing toward the massive carrier that dominated the harbor. She's 1,092 feet long, displaces 100,000 tons, and houses 5,200 personnel when fully manned. He stared up at the ship's island superstructure, which rose 11 stories above the flight deck. It's bigger than I imagined. Everything about carrier operations is bigger than most people imagine. Come on, I'll show you around. For the next 3 hours I gave my father the complete tour. Engineering spaces where nuclear reactors generated enough power to light a small city, hangar bays that could house 60 aircraft, the flight deck where controlled chaos looked like precision choreography. I explained the complexity of launch and recovery operations, the intricate logistics of feeding 5,000 people daily, the split-second decisions required to coordinate multi-million-dollar aircraft in tight formation. He asked questions, good questions that showed he was actually listening, actually trying to understand the scope of what I was responsible for. When we reached the bridge, I introduced him to Commander James Mitchell, my executive officer. "Your daughter runs the tightest ship I've ever served on," Mitchell told him without prompting. "Crew morale is the highest I've seen in 15 years. Operational readiness is at 97%. And her tactical decisions during our last exercise were textbook perfect under pressure." Dad nodded, but I could see him processing information that didn't fit his mental model of who I was. "Sir," Mitchell continued, "I don't know if you realize what an honor it is to serve under Captain Blackwood's command. Officers compete for years just to get assigned to a ship she's commanding. Her reputation for excellence precedes her wherever she goes." After the tour, I led Dad to my private cabin and closed the door. He sat heavily in the chair across from my desk, looking overwhelmed. "I had no idea," he said finally. "No idea about what? Any of it. The complexity, the responsibility, the respect you command from these people. I thought—" He stopped, shaking his head. "I thought you were just another officer on a big ship. I didn't understand that you were running the entire operation." I studied his face, looking for signs of the dismissive attitude that had colored every conversation about my career for 2 decades. Instead, I saw something I'd never seen before, genuine awe. "Why are you here, Dad? Really?" He took a deep breath, the way he used to before delivering bad news about insurance claims or family finances. "Patty played me a recording of myself from your ceremony weekend. I was talking to some strangers in that hotel bar, telling them how I'd always known you were destined for greatness, how the family had always supported your ambitions." He pulled out his phone and scrolled to an audio file. "She also played me this." The recording was from Christmas 3 years earlier. I could hear the familiar background noise of our family gatherings, multiple conversations, children playing, the television broadcasting some holiday movie. And then I heard my father's voice, clear and unmistakable. "Rebecca's always been too stubborn for her own good," he was saying. "Doesn't know when to quit pushing for things that are probably beyond her capabilities. Sarah's got the right idea. Marry a good man, start a family, build something real instead of chasing military fantasy." The words hit like physical blows, even though I'd suspected he felt that way. Hearing him actually say it, hearing the casual dismissal of everything I'd worked for, was different than suspecting it. "I said that," he continued when the recording stopped. "I said those words about you, about your career, about everything you'd accomplished, and then 6 months later, I was telling strangers how proud I'd always been." "Dad, no, let me finish." Patty made me listen to both recordings back to back, made me hear the difference between what I said when I thought it didn't matter, and what I said when it made me look good. "And I realized I'd been doing that for years, undermining you privately while claiming credit publicly." He stood up and walked to the porthole, looking out at Pearl Harbor, where dozens of military vessels represented American naval power around the world. "I've spent my entire life avoiding risk," he said quietly. "Built a business around managing other people's fears, created a life designed to minimize uncertainty and challenge. I told myself it was wisdom, but really it was cowardice." He turned back to face me. "And when my daughter chose courage over safety, chose challenge over comfort, chose service over self-interest, I couldn't recognize it for what it was. I couldn't celebrate your strength because it reminded me of my own weakness." The admission hung in the air between us like smoke from a firing gun. "So instead of supporting you, I spent 20 years trying to convince you that you were just as small as I was. Every time you succeeded, every time you overcame a challenge, every time you proved your capabilities, I found a way to diminish it, because your success made me confront everything I'd been too afraid to attempt." I felt tears gathering behind my eyes, not from sadness but from recognition. This was the conversation I'd been waiting for my entire adult life, not an apology for specific words or actions, but acknowledgement of the pattern that had shaped our relationship for decades. "Why now?" I asked. "Why are you finally seeing this?" "Because Patty forced me to. Because she made me listen to evidence I couldn't deny or rationalize away. Because she loved you enough to risk her relationship with me to defend your honor." He sat back down, leaning forward with his hands clasped. But also because watching you take command of this ship, seeing the respect these sailors have for you, witnessing the responsibility you carry with such competence, it made me realize that I've been wrong about everything. Not just about your capabilities, but about what strength looks like, what leadership means, what courage actually requires. Dad, I appreciate I'm not finished, he said, and there was steel in his voice that I'd rarely heard. I need to say this all because I may never have another chance. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and set it on my desk. This is every article written about your ceremony, every news report, every analysis piece about what your appointment means for the future of naval leadership. I've read them all, multiple times. Do you know what they say about you? I shook my head. They say you're one of the most competent officers of your generation. They say your tactical innovations during the Philippines relief operation will be studied at the Naval War College for decades. They say your leadership during that reactor emergency demonstrated exactly the kind of steady judgment the Navy needs in senior command. He opened the folder and spread the articles across my desk. They say you represent the future of American naval power. They say your appointment proves that merit trumps everything else in military leadership. They say you're exactly the kind of officer our nation needs during uncertain times. I looked down at the headlines, seeing my achievements reflected through the eyes of people who understood their significance. The entire world sees what I was too blind to see, he continued. My daughter isn't lucky or connected or carried by others. She's exceptional. She's exactly where she belongs because she earned it through competence, courage, and 22 years of proving herself under pressure. He closed the folder and met my eyes. I came here to apologize, but also to ask for something I don't deserve. I want a chance to start over. Not to go back and pretend the last 20 years didn't happen, but to build something new going forward. A relationship based on who you actually are instead of who I was too afraid to let you be. The silence stretched between us, filled with the distant sounds of a naval base in operation, helicopters landing, announcements over loudspeakers, the purposeful movement of military personnel going about their duties. What would that look like? I asked finally. I don't know, he admitted. I've spent so long seeing you through the lens of my own limitations, that I'm not sure I know how to see you clearly, but I'd like to learn. I'd like to understand what you do here, what challenges you face, what you need from the people who claim to love you. He leaned back in his chair, looking older but somehow more solid than when he'd arrived. I'd like to be proud of you for the right reasons, not because your success reflects well on me, but because you've become someone worthy of admiration. Not because you're my daughter, but because you're an exceptional leader who happens to be my daughter. I thought about all the years I'd spent seeking this recognition, all the achievements I'd minimized to make him comfortable, all the self-doubt I'd carried because the people who raised me couldn't see my worth. Dad, I said slowly, I don't need you to understand everything I do, but I need you to trust that I'm competent to do it. I need you to believe that when the Navy gives me responsibility, it's because I've earned it. I need you to see my strengths instead of constantly looking for weaknesses. Can you teach me how to do that? The question surprised me with its humility. This was my father asking his daughter to help him become a better man, a better parent, a better supporter of her choices. I can try, I said, but it has to be real this time. No more undermining disguised as concern. No more expressing doubt about my abilities. No more treating my achievements like lucky accidents. And if I slip back into old patterns, then this conversation was just words and we'll go back to being strangers who happen to be related. He nodded, understanding that this was his last chance to get our relationship right. There's one more thing, he said, reaching into his briefcase again. I brought something for you. He handed me a small wooden box, the kind used for military metal. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was his father's Purple Heart, my grandfather's medal from World War II, awarded after he was wounded during the Battle of the Bulge. Grandpa would have been proud of you, he said quietly. He understood what service meant, what sacrifice required, what leadership looked like under fire. I never served, never tested myself the way he did, the way you have. But I think it's time this medal was with someone who earned the right to carry on his legacy. I lifted the Purple Heart from its case, feeling the weight of 3 generations of military service in my hands. Thank you, I said, and meant it completely,
For the first time in 22 years, my father looked at me and saw exactly who I was.
6 months after my father's visit to Pearl Harbor, I stood on the bridge of USS Constellation as we completed our deployment to the South China Sea. It had been the most successful deployment in the ship's history: 3 humanitarian missions, 2 multinational exercises, and a freedom of navigation operation that had required precise diplomacy and flawless execution. My crew had performed beyond expectations, and I'd proven to myself that commanding a carrier wasn't just something I could do, but something I was born to do. But the real transformation hadn't happened on the ocean. It had happened in the quiet moments between operations, in phone calls with family members who were finally learning to see me clearly, and in the growing confidence that came from no longer seeking validation from people who had spent decades proving they couldn't provide it. The change had started with small things. Dad had begun calling every few weeks, not to check on my stress levels or express concern about pressure, but to ask genuine questions about naval operations, geopolitics, and leadership challenges. He'd started reading military news, trying to understand the context of my work instead of dismissing it as dangerous complications in an otherwise simple world. I never realized how much strategy goes into positioning a carrier group, he'd said during our last conversation. I was reading about your exercise with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, and the complexity of coordinating 12 ships from 3 different countries seems impossible. It's challenging, I'd replied, but that's what we train for. That's what good leadership looks like, making the impossible seem routine. I'm starting to understand that, he'd said quietly. I'm starting to understand you. The transformation in our relationship had rippled outward, affecting the entire family dynamic. Mom had started asking about my sailors, not whether they were causing me stress, but whether they were getting the support they needed. She'd begun sending care packages to the ship's junior personnel, understanding for the first time that my leadership extended to taking care of people, not just completing missions. Sarah had been the biggest surprise. 2 months into our deployment, she'd called with an unexpected request. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Okay," I'd said, bracing for another attempt to minimize my achievements, or redirect the conversation to her own concerns. "Am I a coward?" The question had caught me completely off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been thinking about what Patty said, about how we've all built small, safe lives while you've chosen courage and challenge. I've been married to the same man since college, lived in the same town my entire life, never tested myself against anything that might prove I'm not as capable as I think I am." She'd paused, and I could hear her breathing heavily over the satellite connection. "I look at what you've accomplished, the responsibility you carry, the respect you've earned, and I realize I don't know if I'm actually capable of anything difficult, or if I've just been lucky enough to avoid finding out." It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and it had led to others. Sarah had started taking night classes in business administration, exploring opportunities to expand beyond the comfortable routine she'd built. Not because she wanted to compete with my achievements, but because she'd finally understood the difference between safety and stagnation. But the most meaningful change had come from an unexpected source: my nephew Derek, Jake's youngest son, who'd called me 3 weeks into our deployment with a request that had nearly brought me to tears. "Aunt Rebecca, I want to apply to the Naval Academy. Can you help me understand what that means?" Derek was 17, a high school senior who'd been planning to follow his father's path into the family insurance business. But watching the ceremony coverage, and hearing the conversations that followed, had opened his eyes to possibilities he'd never considered. "Are you sure?" I'd asked. "Naval service isn't something you do casually. It requires commitment, sacrifice, and the willingness to put service before self-interest." "I've been thinking about that," he'd said. "I've been thinking about the difference between a job and a calling, between making money and making a difference. I want to serve something bigger than myself." The conversation that followed had been one of the most rewarding of my career, not because I was recruiting another officer, but because I was finally able to share my passion for service with someone who could understand its value. Derek had spent hours researching the academy, studying naval history, preparing himself for the challenges ahead. When Jake had called to discuss his son's plans, his tone had been completely different than any conversation we'd had about military service. "I don't understand it," he'd admitted,
but I can see that Derek does. I can see that this means something to him the way it's always meant something to you. I want to support him, but I need to understand what I'm supporting. You're supporting his decision to serve his country. You're supporting his choice to test himself against the highest standards, to develop leadership skills that will serve him for life, to be part of something larger than his own interests. Is it dangerous? Life is dangerous, Jay. But Derek will be trained by the best military in the world, surrounded by people who've sworn to protect each other, and equipped with skills that will make him capable of handling whatever challenges he faces. Will you help him? The question had represented a complete reversal of 22 years of family dynamics. Instead of questioning my judgment, Jake was asking me to guide his son's future. Instead of expressing doubt about military service, he was trusting my expertise to prepare Derek for success. Of course I'll help him, I'd said. It would be an honor. Now, as USS Constellation steamed toward our home port in San Diego, I reflected on how much had changed since that phone call from Admiral Martinez 18 months earlier. The external transformation was obvious. I commanded one of the most powerful warships in the world, led 5,000 sailors with confidence and competence, and had earned recognition as one of the Navy's rising stars, but the internal transformation was more profound. I no longer sought validation from people who were constitutionally incapable of providing it. I no longer minimized my achievements to make others comfortable. I no longer carried the burden of proving myself to family members who had spent decades demonstrating their inability to see my work. The phone in my cabin rang, interrupting my thoughts. My communications officer informed me that Admiral Martinez was calling with new orders. Captain Blackwood, Admiral Martinez began. Congratulations on an exceptional deployment. Your performance has been noted at the highest levels of Navy leadership. Thank you, Admiral. Constellation and her crew exceeded all expectations. Indeed they did. Which brings me to the reason for my call. How would you feel about a promotion to Rear Admiral and assignment as Commander Carrier Strike Group 3? The words hit me like a shockwave. Rear Admiral, flag rank, command of an entire carrier strike group, multiple ships, thousands of personnel, strategic responsibility that spanned entire ocean regions. I would be honored, Admiral. I managed, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. The ceremony will be held at the Naval War College in 6 weeks. Your family will receive official invitations, of course. After the call ended, I sat in my cabin, staring at the news that would reshape my entire career trajectory. Rear Admiral Rebecca Blackwood, the first woman to command Carrier Strike Group 3. Another historic moment, another ceiling shattered, another proof point that competence and courage mattered more than gender or background. But this time, instead of wondering whether my family would understand the significance, I found myself excited to share the news with people who had finally learned to celebrate my achievements without qualification. I called Dad first. Admiral Blackwood, I said when he answered. I like the sound of that. Are you serious? His voice was filled with genuine excitement, not the performative enthusiasm he'd shown at previous promotions. Rear Admiral Rebecca, that's incredible. It means I'll be responsible for an entire strike group, 5 ships, over 7,000 personnel, strategic operations across the Pacific. It's the culmination of everything I've worked toward. I'm so proud of you, he said, and I could hear tears in his voice. Not because you're my daughter, but because you're exactly the kind of leader our country needs. You've earned this through excellence, and I couldn't be more honored to be your father. The conversation that followed was everything I'd always wanted from my family: genuine interest in my work, intelligent questions about my responsibilities, and unconditional support for my continued growth. Dad had become someone I could share my professional challenges with, someone who understood that my success reflected my own capabilities, rather than lucky accidents. I called Derek next, knowing that his reaction would be pure and unfiltered by decades of complicated family dynamics. Aunt Rebecca, that's amazing, he shouted when I told him the news. A Rear Admiral, do you know what this means for my academy application? I get to write that my aunt is a flag officer. Derek, I said, laughing at his enthusiasm, you'll get into the academy based on your own merits, not mine, but I hope my example shows you what's possible when you commit to excellence and refuse to accept other people's limitations as your own. It does, he said seriously. It shows me that the Blackwood family can produce leaders, not just followers, that we can serve something bigger than ourselves, that courage isn't just for other people. That evening, as we approached the San Diego harbor where thousands of family members waited to welcome their sailors home, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Not just the naval career that had culminated in flag rank, but the personal journey from seeking approval to commanding respect, from doubting my worth to understanding my value, from accepting others' limitations as my own, to defining my own possibility. The young woman who'd thrown up before high school debate team tryouts had become a rear admiral in the United States Navy. The anxious teenager who'd been afraid to drive to her own birthday party now commanded nuclear-powered warships in international water. The daughter who'd spent decades seeking family validation had finally learned that the only opinion that mattered was her own. Standing on the bridge of USS Constellation as we entered San Diego Bay, I saw my family waiting on the pier. Dad was wearing a Navy baseball cap he'd bought during his visit to Pearl Harbor. Mom was holding a sign that read "Welcome Home, Admiral Blackwood." Sarah was there with her children, Derek was wearing his ROTC uniform, and Patty stood in her marine dress blues, saluting as we passed. They looked distant to me now, not because they had changed completely, but because I had changed how I saw them. They were no longer the judges whose approval I desperately needed, but people I loved who were finally learning to love me as I actually was, rather than as they'd needed me to be. The transformation was complete, but the journey was just beginning. As Rear Admiral, I would face new challenges, greater responsibilities, and opportunities to shape the future of naval leadership. I would mentor young officers who reminded me of my younger self, help them understand that competence could overcome any obstacle, and show them that the only limitations that truly mattered were the ones they accepted for themselves. But most importantly, I would do it all as myself, not as someone seeking validation or approval, but as a leader who had finally learned that the most important battle was the one fought within, the battle to believe in your own worth regardless of who else could see it. I was Captain Rebecca Blackwood when this story began, desperate for family approval and uncertain of my own value. I was now Rear Admiral Rebecca Blackwood, confident in my abilities and secure in the knowledge that I had become exactly who I was meant to be.
The scared little girl who'd once needed permission to succeed had become the woman who gave herself permission to excel, and that transformation was worth more than any medal, any promotion, or any recognition the world could offer. Because I had finally learned the most important lesson of all: the only validation that truly matters is the kind you give yourself. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you, right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.